Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just getting all the things hooked up here.
Well, yeah,
Uh-oh.
no. We appreciate your time, by the
Yeah.
way.
Thank you.
So, we'll start with introductions. Can you tell us your name and who you are? A little bit about what you do, even?
Uh, so, I've heard part of that. Introductions, like who am I?
Who are
Yeah.
you? What do you do? A little bit about yourself.
Yeah. How
Okay.
many of the books did you read back there?
Uh, oh gosh, that's a fun one. Okay, so I'm Liam O'Mara. I am a history professor. I did my graduate work at UCI. I teach at Chapman and CSU Dominguez Hills. I'm my discipline is the history of ideas. So I study like big, transnational concepts, economic systems, religious systems, all that kind of stuff. But my teaching field's in the Middle East and Europe. Um,
Hmm.
Sweet. And
so for as far as
you were
books,
also a candidate
there's
back a few
there's
years ago, right?
sorry. What was that?
I'm sorry. I cut you off. You go
Oh
ahead.
no, you'd asked about the all this. I mean,
Yeah.
there are 52 of these in the house. It's practically all I
Dang.
own is books.
You trying to match the presidents. I see.
Just books and inherited antiques is about all I own.
Hmm.
And so it's I'm in the alcove part where like I've got back to back bookcases kind of like going out as a partial wall separating the what should be a master bedroom but is actually a library. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of
Okay.
this house is a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Stuff squeezed
man.
everywhere.
Is that room like dry? Because paper pulling the moisture out of the air. Like,
Well, it would be relatively dry anyway, since I mean I'm in an alpine part of it because I'm at six
okay.
thousand feet, but I'm technically in the high desert,
Oh,
Hmm.
so the air's pretty dry here regardless.
okay. Well, damn.
So I,
Perfect.
I I'll run humidifiers when I need to and this and that. But
And you were also a candidate a few years back. Is that right?
I was, yeah. I decided to jump into the Democratic Party and a primary and see what people would think of it, and it went honestly surprisingly well for a couple of years. I was fairly shocked that it worked, but
Hmm.
it was fun. It was an interesting experiment.
Yeah. Well, why did you decide to run? Like, what was like your biggest motivations to get in the race?
Well, a big motivation overall would be I'm fairly disgusted by the direction of this country. It's been particularly bad in the last 50 years, but there's problems all throughout its history that I have issues with. And I have a very dim view of politicians in general. So I wanted to see if I could get in, be a bit of a gadfly, try to raise issues, be one of those people that the party is always trying to shut up because they're willing to speak out on the floor about inconvenient truths. I think that there needs to be more people willing to speak truth to power, and it's a shame that our political system is essentially captured by big money interests, and they get to call all the shots. So it's usually all worked out well before anything comes up to a discussion in Congress. Everyone just knows what they're supposed to do. I'm just disgusted by it. But the specific impetus for me, like why me and not somebody else. I I've been noticing a lot of things just generally generationally in terms of what people are okay with. So like a lot of our older generation would look askance at a candidate with a beard. Younger voters don't. So okay. And then I've seen a rash of really um more unconventional and even populist candidates. So on either side, both Trump and Bernie are in essence a kind of inspiration because they're people that should never have been able to do well in politics. I mean, when Bernie announced in 2015, I was like, yeah, this is great. I love this guy. I've been following him since since the beginning of the 90s. I'm like, cool, but it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to collapse immediately. And well, holy crap, he starts winning states. So that's when I decided to register as a Democrat and get involved in supporting those things, and then figured when I had a moment between projects, I was like, well, I don't know, why don't I get involved? And if nothing else, I'll be involved in a primary, get to push things along, see what happens there. And one thing led to another.
And just a little tangent because we've talked about this on the show before. What are your thoughts on Jesse Ventura? Uh,
Yeah.
In general, I like the idea of anybody outside of the duopoly getting involved. I have mixed feelings about his views specifically, but that's more or less true of any politician. There's nobody that I have no disagreements with. I was happy to see that he got involved and was actually able to win high office without being connected either to the parties, because that's relatively rare in the last century.
Why go with the Democrats? Why not independent or a third party?
Because generally speaking, there's about zero chance it'll work. Especially since I was running in a very Republican district. It was an R+9 in the Cook report, so it's considered a safe Republican seat, which means that most Democrats are going to vote party line and be Democrats. If you run as independent, you're only going to pick up a few of the tiny, fringe, outside whatever that's left out of that. You'll end up at third place regardless. So you can't even get through the jungle primary, which would make it essentially a vanity run. And I don't want to run to feel cool about myself, because I don't give a damn what people think of me. I don't want power. I want to actually get involved and try to fix things. So I figured, and mathematically this actually works out. If you want to think about the numbers about it in a minute, let me know. But pardon me. The generally speaking, in any election, especially in more conservative areas, the Democrats are going to come out for whatever Democrat's in the ballot. Doesn't matter if they agree with all of his positions or not. They'll vote for the D because they hate the R. But me running with my kind of outsider sensibility and running as an explicit leftist, I picked up a ton of independent and youth voters that would not have voted for a Democrat. So it creates a larger coalition. And if you're going to be competitive in districts like that, that's what Democrats need to do. Democrats tend to, in conservative areas, run to the right and try to chase conservative voters, and it's a waste of time. I mean, your choice if you're a right winger and your choice is between a hard right candidate and right wing light, what are you going to pick? I mean, it's a nonsensical argument, but tons and tons of leftists and populists are routinely left out of the equation, and they are the two single largest voting demographics that just aren't represented by the major parties. Because we have two right-wing parties.
That's pretty weird, because you look at polls and stats, at least like I looked at a lot of Latino politics stats, right? Like I took some classes at UCLA about Latino politics, and you look at the voting demographics, there is a lot of independent voters who would just love like race class messaging or like populist economic messaging, and it's just not put to the forefront. And it's like you can gain a lot more positive polarizing responses from that than you would with even just like typical pro-immigration rhetoric, which really turned a lot of heads, because it's like a lot of people think like, oh, just stick with like the baseline issues of immigration, but a lot of them care about economic populism. A lot of them care about like $15 minimum wage, getting benefits.
Right. I mean, go figure. That was the whole. I mean, if you're looking at any population that is descended from migrants, whether it's in more recent decades or in the last 2 centuries, people want a better life for their kids. They care about those kitchen table issues, those basic bread and butter shit. Like, how can I make life better? How can you improve education and healthcare and basic, working conditions and wages? Hell, a $15 minimum wage is not even close to what California needs, and people are still struggling. There's literally nowhere in the country that a $15 wage will get you an apartment. It just doesn't work anymore. So talking about the things that really matter, draw in people that are turned off by just the back and forth nonsense between the parties that doesn't really address the key issues for them. But if I'm focusing on issues that are atypical for a lot of Democrats, it doesn't matter. They're still going to come along because of the way parties work in general. So if people want to win as outsiders, they're honestly better off trying to take over one of these parties. To like get involved, like, use that as a vehicle, because you're going to, along the way, radicalize a bunch of the libs, like drag them with you. And, it worked. So, and regardless of how anything would have worked out, I'm always going to be happy with at least that. Like it proved the model. With 153,000 votes in the general, I had 50,000 more than any candidate in the entire history of the district had ever gotten as a Democrat. half again as more votes as anybody had ever gotten. Something about the messaging was working.
Did you happen to hire any like political strategists to help formulate your message, or were you just going like your ideals?
Just as
what
a
you
side
believe?
note, that's his major.
Yeah, methods and models,
He's
political science.
Yeah,
So
looking for
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, and the whole consultant sphere in politics is, it's so massively overpriced that you end up spending all of your time raising money from rich people just to be able to afford the consultants who are going to come up with a message that they think works in other districts. And again, one of my reasons for getting involved was to show they're wrong. Like the way that I talked to a number of them just to see at the beginning when I was thinking about getting involved in running, like, okay, well, what would you think would work in this district? And I did pretty much the opposite of what all of them said, and got closer to, a good number for it than anybody else. If it wasn't for people, like the massive turnout because of Trump, and people, it was a massively Republican district, so people wanted to support Trump. So there you go. I mean, if it had been a normal year, it could have won. And in the last race, the candidate that followed me running in that same area brought in far fewer voters, and he raised it's just an order of magnitude over it. I mean, I think I raised less than 150,000 in the entire race, and he raised over 3 million, and came no closer to winning. And his demographics were better because of redistricting. He was only in an R+3. So it's like my experience of that and of the races before and afterwards validate the model for me, based on my observation of tons of races around the country and what I wanted to try and do going in. As far as the rest of it, I would have had a hard time anyway, like working with people carefully sculpting your image and your message and everything else, just because
like more robotic.
Well, I'm deeply turned off by that type of politics, by the crooked finger, like you get certain things that you repeat these certain buzzwords, and you never actually talk about policy. And I know a lot of voters don't want to hear about policy or whatever, but the way around that for me, and there's good research on this too, I talked a lot about principles and values, and that does work. It touches the same kind of emotional core for a lot of people and what they're looking for. And I get to tie my principles to what I would actually propose we do to solve problems. I'm at the end of the day, I'm an autistic egghead. I'm not really a politician type. I'm never going to have the perfectly sculpted image. So I just ran authentically as myself and wanted to see what happened.
So I guess for me, something that I've been seeing a lot on the left is a bit of apathy, especially from people in my age group, because Biden withdrawing from the debates, and the general lack of I think appeal to our issues. Do you think there are any viable alternatives to Biden right now in the general election, or the primary elections?
Define viable.
Well, yeah, that's
so I know what you
many
so
roads.
What you mean.
Many roads to that question.
Man,
what do you mean by it? So I'm not sure how to answer the question.
Well, I guess we could start with, do you think somebody like RFK, he just went independent, do you think like he has a chance to even compete? No, right? Yeah. Okay.
And well, if you're asking, will Williamson beat Biden in a primary? Hell no. I mean, there's literally no chance of it. I will be happy if she has a decent showing, but no, it's not going to get past the primary.
So do you think, so the progressives right now just lack a good candidate? Do you think that's a part of the problem, or do you think it's also just because of the Biden sort of just having that stranglehold on the incumbency?
Some of it is the same systemic problems we've had for decades, and the way that the parties have locked up so much of the power. I mean, the decisions are often made long before it even gets to the voters. It's really, we've switched to where most races are primaries now, where you go back to the 1960s and very few of them were. But it's still worked out in a lot of those back rooms, where who's going to run, how it's going to run, what it's going to look like, who's actually going to get attention on this. And realistically, and this is one of the underlying problems of the whole kit and caboodle, primaries aren't legally binding elections. They're not, they could ignore them. I mean, the two parties, they're corporations, and they ultimately get to choose whatever candidate they want. So somebody like a Williamson could win 90% of the vote everywhere, and they could still just nominate Biden. It ultimately doesn't make a difference in that way. So there are serious structural issues, and then there's all kinds of money issues on top of that, and visibility and media issues, and you're right in terms of candidates. There's just not that many people that are well enough known, right, and charismatic enough to kind of like jump ahead. So it's also a problem.
You know, there is one person I kind of like that I've heard brought up, but I kind of agree with you. Kind of applies to them too. Nina Turner seems sort of appealing, but you know, maybe in due
No,
time.
she very much is as a person and as a candidate, but she sort of struggles in electoral politics still. There's no, I mean, there's no real machine around it. She couldn't win a congressional seat, you know, in a district that was actually competitive for her. So it's when we looking at candidates that have a history of already losing something, the key is not necessarily to think, well, there's a problem with the person, because there's not. She's fantastic. There are systemic issues here that make it harder to get ahead. I think that she could eventually spring into something there, like that she could actually become like significant. But what helped us with Bernie, like part of the magic formula for Bernie was, you know, not only his consistency and authenticity, so people could look back, you know, 30 years worth of speeches and he's saying the same shit, so you know he's not doing it for the money or whatever. Then there's the fact that he's effective and charismatic, willing to do the work, but one of the a kind of underrated part of the formula is the fact that he had been winning. He had a position, you know, and he had a proven way of doing it, of a ground game that would work in a rural state. That realistically, if they'd managed to scale that up and work a lot harder in a lot of areas in the country, if they'd had the resources, they could have done well. But more people were willing to bet on him as a candidate because he had served as a mayor in the House and in the Senate.
Do you think they would have, like, if Bernie had won, do you think they wouldn't have let him, like, they wouldn't have recognized him as the winner of the primary? So you brought up how it's not legally binding. Like, do you think if somebody like Bernie came in and won, they would just say, "Oh no, we're just gonna like put in Clinton instead"?
Man, that would be like the nuclear option. Holy.
Exactly. It's possible, but relatively unlikely. And one of the things that also, and I guess you can add this on as another element of his formula, is that even though he has his principles, he frequently will work with people. It's why he's like the amendment king, and he's always able to slip things in because he has good relationships with everybody. They regardless of what anybody thinks of his politics, almost everyone respects him on either side of the aisle. So it helps a lot. He's willing to be a team player. And I think that they would know that. So by allowing him to actually be the candidate, they would gain some influence. And, you know, it'd end up being more of a collaborative effort, where as if he took like a very hardline anti-party in doing it, they probably would have pulled a nuclear option, you know, like in 68 or something, and put somebody up that didn't even run or whatever. I mean, they'd still have a way out of it. But yeah, I would have considered it unlikely if he had actually won either of those.
I want to round back to something you said earlier about the you know, doing the opposite of what a lot of the you know, what are they called, the counselors or whoever
Consultants.
Consultants, thank you. Yeah. Consultants that you talk to. So how did you come up with your policies exactly, you know, when you were running and your platform? How did you come up with your platform?
Well, most of it was a matter of a compromise between my own preferences and principles and what could actually work. I mean, I'm at the end of the day, I'm fairly pragmatic. So I can figure out, okay, this is the closest I can get to what I would want. Here's something we can run with. And then once you have those ideas, because I won't advocate for something that I don't actually think is a good idea. So then I take those ideas and figure out which ones actually have have drawn popular support. So you look at like polling data, and particularly not partisan polls or what's won in particular races, because that's a whole different metric for me. I wanted to know, what do younger voters say that they want? What do the leftist independents say that they want? What do libertarian independents say that they want? What do all these different groups of people that aren't usually served by the system find appealing? And then because I'm trying to draw them into the coalition, right? So you're trying to find certain things that will attract people. Like it's how I ended up falling into the basic income as an idea, because it's an idea that has frequently appeared on both right and left. There are solid right-wing arguments for it going back into the middle of the 20th century, as well as left-wing arguments like, MLK was advocating for it. I mean, a way to raise people out of poverty. So it was a way to draw in an existing base of people that already liked something, but no major candidate was talking about. So it's a lot of things like that. I don't know if that's clear enough.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah,
that's perfect. If it looks like we look boggled-eyed like deer in headlights, it's because they're literally headlights at us, blinding right now. So you're good.
It's fine, yeah.
So I gotta ask, you got canceled. Was it during your run?
Oh no. It was afterwards. It was early in the next year.
Okay.
And
gotta be pragmatic. I understand.
Well, no, it was about an incident that happened after the race anyway, so it was sort of ultimately unconnected to it. I am a pretty hardcore anti-fascist and anti-racist. If I see bullshit, I'll call it out, and I'm not necessarily nice about it. But while a candidate, I try to be a bit more politic and civil in the way that I put things. I did my best. I did my autistic best, but I hadn't been sleeping well because the house I'd had at the time had been broken into repeatedly. Some of the early ones were, I think, targeted because they broke in and stole computers and hard drives and rifled through my closet for papers, but they ignored all like the antiques and stuff. They ignored like anything valuable. They just went for papers. But once the house had been broken into, people kept coming, and I couldn't board things up and lock things up fast enough. So it was a lot of quickly packing things up to get it out of there as fast as possible so I didn't lose more things. And I made a 2 a.m. tweet that I should have done a little differently. Because as far as I'm concerned, the point still stands. The rhetoric that Candace Owens uses is deeply racist. She's paraphrasing literal Klan members. I mean, it's the same exact arguments. And I say that as an academic expert in those issues. I have an entire wall of studies of racist and fascist rhetoric, of white supremacist rhetoric. She's using all of that shit, but gets away with it, because of what she looks like.
Yeah.
And the arguments are a problem for me and I want to call out the arguments. So I'm like, this is Klan rhetoric. I should have phrased it in a way that would be harder for the right to misconstrue. So that's on me. I should not be. I should have been holding my phone at 2 a.m. So, but whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of co-opting. It's odd that as long as the person is of color, it's okay to bring up a lot of those arguments. And
yeah, exactly. And it's what bothers me consistently, and honestly, it's one of the background issues that got me interested in trying to run, especially in a very conservative area, was okay. So just observing as a historian, the way that these arguments have been building up for a long time, the kinds of populist, hard right, conspiracy theory rhetoric that has been completely normalized by this point, like since the 1980s, really. I mean, Ronald Reagan was literally a bircher, right? He was like deep in the conspiracy theory, like rabbit hole, and brought that into the mainstream, where you go back to the 1960s, most Republicans are like, yeah, we're not going to touch this like crazy shit. But since the 1980s, it has become the mainstream. And the problem is, it's often literally fascist and white supremacist arguments. They're deeply troubling. It is very obvious the provenance of these ideas and what they relate to. But people constantly get away. They're like they're saying the most racist shit. I'm like, but I'm not racist. I'm like, okay, can we not judge people by their actions? Because words matter, and whenever you point this stuff out, it's like well, you can't compare me to Hitler because we don't have like concentration camps or something. I'm like, okay, so first off, let's ignore like Guantanamo Bay and the migrant detention facilities that are concentration camps and all that shit. Let's set that aside for a minute here. um Hitler didn't have concentration camps in 1924. Did that mean he wasn't a fascist then? It's like it doesn't matter. The ideas are the ideas, and ideas have consequences in the world. And I want to draw attention to those. I want us to take them seriously. And it bothers me that it's essentially a joke to a lot of people. Right now, today, the Democratic Party is a conservative capitalist party. And the Republican Party is literally a neo-fascist party. It cannot in any way be described as conservative. But they get away with using the word still. And to me, this is just, to me as a historian, in terms of the principles, this is a problem, and it really bodes ill for where we're going as a country.
So there was a comment you made a bit earlier that I thought was also a bit interesting, the vanity run comment.
Right.
And would what are your reactions to the to like Cornel West also running? I know I kind of asked you earlier about the other, but it seems like for a lot of those people who are doing the third party run, the independent run, it seems like, I like the term. It seems like it applies to a lot of them,
It does. In the main thing they're doing is raising awareness of issues. The reason I was willing to jump into the Democratic Party to do it was it follows along with the model that Bernie's using. He was not going to run for president as an independent because it's like mathematically stupid. Like it's not possible. So he was going to run as a Democrat. And that makes sense. It doesn't mean your principles have to change. The running outside of an existing system, when we know how it is structured, our Constitution was written in the 18th century for, an elitist, society that only wanted 5% of people to vote anyway. It has serious problems in the way that, our State Department has helped tons of other countries write constitutions in the last century, and we have never used our own as a model, like ever, because it doesn't work. But it is what it is, and there's no easy way to change it. And wishing it away by running independent doesn't help anything. It doesn't mean that there isn't some value in raising awareness to issues, but that's all it is. And what was beautiful about Bernie was that he managed to mainstream a few ideas like Medicare for all, and brought it to where in polls, even a majority of Republicans would support it now. It depends on how the question is asked, but a majority of Republicans come out for it, not to mention everybody else. And Bernie's rhetoric has played a significant part in making it mainstream. So running hard for those ideas within the broken system still gives you the ability to change the narrative, which is what Cornel West is trying to do, but there's also a chance of really getting in there to do something. And as much as I love Brother West, he's not going to win, right? The nice thing about some of those, and I was actually a big supporter of Nader, and I'll admit it, I voted for Nader 3 times even when he ran as an independent, because I'm in California, so I was going to go for the Democrats anyway. Who cares? But when he ran as a Green, there was at least the possibility of competing within the system, because there are certain advantages to having a party around it. As an independent, it's very difficult to gain ballot access. It's hard to get media coverage. There's a ton of things that get in the way there. And the main thing that he's missing is the money. So if you can latch on to good issues and find people who are willing to send money, like people were sending, Bernie $5 at a time. If you can get somebody to do that, then great. But again, our voting system means that people are less likely to take independents or third parties seriously. So yeah. I don't like the system at all. Like, I'm not saying, hey, we should all be Democrats or Republicans. But reality is what it is.
He thinks we should all be Democrat.
I was thinking like I mean, vote blue no matter who, I guess. But to talk about the money gap, like I had tried. I guess I shouldn't say the name of the campaign, but it was a LA City Council member, and I thought I was canvassing like under his campaign, but technically it was under a firm contracted with his campaign, and it felt so cold. And it's like, all right, well, we're here, we're hired to go for him. He's paid the money for us to say like X, Y, and Z, and here's what you can legally say. And I'm just like, man, this feels so disconnected. And the thing is, and it's also, it puts him ahead because he can hire, like contract an actual firm, while a lot of people who aren't as connected or didn't grow up with a, like a silver spoon, gold spoon, or didn't run to money, like you're just at such a disadvantage. And I just wonder if with your run, do you feel like normal people have a shot in like certain districts?
I mean, to think about it, you did take that money really far. You said earlier it was like 150K, right?
Yeah, it was less than that, but yeah,
you got 43%. Like that's, I mean, talk about getting your bang for
in an R+9 district in a presidential year where people were voting for Trump. So yeah, it's I mean, the percentage is less important to me than the total number, because again, the best anybody had ever done was 103,000. And there was 153. So a lot more people showed up. We managed to hit a lot more people with our message. But it forced us to run essentially a volunteer campaign. Almost none of my staff were paid a dime. I mean, I would buy snacks here or there, but, we were all just poor people pitching in and doing the work. It's possible in some districts. I think, honestly, if people want to make populist runs or run from the left, you're better off doing that in more conservative districts, because in a Democratic district, the party will crush you. I mean, their priority is to crush progressives much more so than it is to beat Republicans. And you can see that over and over again in the last half century. But in a rural district like I was running, they weren't going to bother. I mean, I managed to get unanimously endorsed by the largest Democratic Party in the country as a long-haired, long-bearded anarchist. I mean, it's they were kind of like stuck with me because I was better organized and spoke better than anybody else they had. So I got in. And then from there, it's a matter of trying to make your money go as far as you can. If you had any kind of like larger infrastructure, a better way to getting media, oftentimes doing even small shows, like small YouTube shows or whatever, would get me donations from all across the country. People would send $20 here. If somebody better organized, than me, but with the same kind of overall strategy, where it was able to do this, I absolutely think it works. You just needed a little bit more money. If we had raised a bit more money than we did, we could have started. I mean, near the end, we had like Spanish language radio ads running and things like that. If we'd been able to do things like that much earlier and build up more of the support there, and if I'd been able to, the pandemic also got in the way. Think about that turnout again during the pandemic. For the entire last year of the campaign, I wasn't able. The last public appearance I did was in March, and then the elections in November. That entire time, I was not physically campaigning anywhere, which also slows things down. When I was able to like show up at different meetings and meet people and talk to them, it helped a lot.
Sounded like Calvert, absent,
Oh yeah, he's never. Yeah, but yeah, the pandemic just sort of made everybody kind of absent because we were all kind of like locked down and unable to have like big events just for fear of spreading the stuff around. So it was a weird time to be running, but again, that it did as well as it did tells me that a well-organized campaign that can raise even a tolerable amount of money, that is willing to go out there and talk to people and talk to like anybody. I mean, I was going and hanging out, talking to Republican groups who all hated me by ideas, like, and then they start hearing me, and then it's like, well, I don't hate you as a person, and that doesn't sound terrible. I mean, oftentimes you can have I've had conversations with literal self-described conservative Republicans and asking them to describe how they would want things to work. Just going back and forth kind of Socratically. And at the end of it, I'm like, dude, you're describing socialism. Like, this is like, you hate the buzzword, but you're kind of okay with what I'm after. But you can't do that with just like video clips or something. You have to be able to talk to people. They have to see you and recognize your authenticity and be able to ask their questions and see that somebody is honestly willing to take the time to talk to them. I really wish that Democrats went back and were still doing that. You go back, into the 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, literal Marxists used to get, a third of the vote in places like Oklahoma. I mean, socialists used to run much of Wisconsin. I mean, you don't have to be shying away from these ideas in more rural areas, but it depends on how you phrase them, how you talk to people. The framing of issues really matters. And when it's just reduced to like internet buzzwords and whatever, it's very easy to drown everybody out. It needs that personal touch.
And that's a really succinct answer. A lot of the common things that we were taught, like especially in like government class and political science classes, always talk about I think statistically the person with more money is bound to win, which is it's borne out. But the fact of it is that I think the landscape is changing so much that it's making it possible for candidates like you to run. Because
right.
And the one thing that shocked me about what you said was running in conservative districts. I'm not gonna lie. You would think, at least I would think, that you should run somewhere where they would be amenable to you, like a place that's already kind of Democrat. But you're right, the absence of a party is probably better off than fighting the party.
It helps, right? Exactly. And because the party structure itself is solidly right wing, they are addicted to the money. They want to stay on Wall Street's teat. They don't want anybody that's going to threaten that. So if you've got somebody out there saying like, get all money out of politics, they're going to do anything they can to stop you. And the larger the party it is, the better funded the party is. The party can basically just drown their voters in mailers against you, and they will. They've done it again and again and again. In government classes, they're going to tell you, generally speaking, the better funded candidate wins, but over and over again, better funded candidates lose. I mean, I don't know. Look at a fun one. So there's a lot of like realignments in our politics in the 1960s. Because both parties used to have very different economic positions, but a similar amount of racists, and they kind of like realigned along the social issues. And ended up agreeing much more on the economic ones, which there are good and bad parts to that. But part of the process, if you think about it, a lot of the people running to try and keep the Republican Party the way it was, they were much better funded. I mean, you had Nelson frickin' Rockefeller like dumping huge amounts of cash in it, and the voters they didn't care. Like they were more interested in the more radical message that Goldwater was spitting out. All he had to do was raise enough money to get his ideas out there and have enough of a ground game, like volunteers or ordinary people out there spreading that message on their own. And he swamped the system.
I mean,
there's tons of examples of that.
So you're saying that withdrawing completely from voting to let the system burn is not actually a good idea.
Yeah, I am not an accelerationist. No. Okay. I think that if things do not actually improve, when you look at a ton of the major systemic problems we have, not only our steadily declining freedom, we're down to 62nd in the world, our steadily increasing poverty. I mean, we're down to like 27th in social mobility. I mean, there's tons of issues like that, but also the climate crisis. And you're going to see just countless millions of climate refugees in coming decades, just like rushing north and south, trying to get the hell away from the hotter areas. I mean, if the way things are going now, it's going to tip us into a dictatorship. I don't see any way out of that. And if that does, then that's going to end up forcing you into kind of like revolutionary politics. Because, hello, if I live in a dictatorship, I am not going to be happy with that. And I don't want that kind of system. I would like it if we can avoid any kind of collapse in our society. I don't want everything to like go to shit. I don't want violence in the streets. If we don't fix this stuff, that's going to happen. History is a great guide to this kind of stuff. When you have crises building up that are not addressed at all, and all it takes is a few like international events to sort of precipitate it, to like tip things over the edge. And climate change is very much in line to do something like that. Not to mention the tons of physical conflicts that are going to be building up from it, tons and tons of wars. As people are moving around, there's going to be a lot more conflict in the world. More conflict, that brings out more and more the jingoism, the nationalist rhetorics and whatnot there. It feeds into their stuff here. So it does not look good for us. I want to be an optimist. As much as I can see the writing on the wall, I want to believe we can avoid this and that things aren't going to go to hell. I don't want Red Dawn in this country. I don't want like Wolverines in the hill. I don't want to see that shit. I want us all to prosper together. And that means getting involved in the primary process, getting better candidates out there, pushing hard to change the system as it is. If we leave the current assholes in charge, nothing's going to get better. Oh, sorry. I should have asked about that. Can I not swear on this program?
We swear a lot.
You're good.
Okay, good. Because I was a trucker, so
Oh,
You were a trucker?
I was a fourth generation longshoreman.
Damn.
I used to unload container ships and drive trucks in the port.
Wow, we're real working class. Damn.
Yeah,
See?
I mean, none of my family had ever gone to college. I was
Wow.
the first one, and I didn't jump into. I started college at 30.
I mean, to be honest with you, at the end of the day, I think it's really good that average normal people are getting involved in politics. I think that's a part of what's been missing.
Yeah.
Speaking about conflict, I was going to ask you some stuff about the Israeli-Hamas conflict, but
Right.
I was going to ask if you want to take a break or use the bathroom real quick before we get into that.
Oh, let me check make sure there's no message on here. Okay, good. I'm fine. I do have to occasionally keep an eye here because AAA is coming to help jump my truck. The battery's completely dead. I gotta move it because some people are coming to work in the house tomorrow. Whatever. But no.
Oh yeah, no.
I've got nowhere else to be. I don't need to get up right now. So
stranded in this car dependent world. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I live on a steep slope. There's no way I can push this thing into where I need it to go without breaking something. So I need somebody to be able to jump it for me to move it.
All right. Well, so I guess the start it all off, the initial. I guess I'm gonna have to just ask you the question where we might actually disagree. I'm of the opinion personally that Israel is under some obligation to respond to the attacks. You can't have several thousand rockets fly into your, and I understand the background, I understand the context full, but in the moment, you have to respond to that. Now, my concern is, what does mission accomplished mean for Israel? Like, what is the end goal? Does it mean 5 dead Palestinians per dead Israeli? Does it mean leveling the strip completely? Like, that is the fear I have about it. Does that the mission objective doesn't seem to be there. There doesn't seem to be an objective, like a clear one. I don't know if you agree.
I mean, there is an objective. It's just not what we want to think about, honestly.
What do you think that objective is?
Well, I mean, honestly, okay. So let's start with the question of. Oh wait. Can we pause for just? I don't know if this is live or recorded.
This is live, but
it's also
recorded as well.
Well, I told them to text. I don't know I don't recognize this number. I'm gonna assume
we can fill air. We can fill air.
I'm gonna assume it's not AAA. We'll just leave it.
Okay.
Yeah, just know that if you need to step away, we can fill air, and it's also recorded. We edit these and put clips up. So
there's a hold on a second. There's a. Oh, great! They ignored the appointment. I called us an appointment time between 6:30 and 7:30. I got a message saying we'll arrive in a few minutes. I can hear a horn outside. They might be here.
You're good.
They're just they ignored me. If you can feel air for just a minute, I'm gonna run out.
We'll look at your political ads, the puppets, but we're good.
Have fun with some of Safi's videos. Sure, I'll be right back.
All right.
All right. Hello.
1 second. We're putting ourselves back.
Yep.
There you go. We just spent the last 20 minutes talking about cars.
Yeah, car problems,
Cars.
fixing cars.
Real,
Yeah.
real manly
Just
things.
striking memories.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So fun life lesson: the appointment feature for AAA battery service does not work. Oh well.
Tell us, what was your first car?
My first was a 1977 MGB that I set out to rebuild. So we just stripped it down to nothing, dipped the block in acid, started putting it all back together. Got it, got it mostly back together, but found out that there was no way I was going to be able to afford the insurance. This young driver, sports car. So I ended up selling it and buying a junker I didn't like, but whatever.
It's a rite of passage. Having that bucket, having a car that, you're willing to sacrifice on the altar of a tree.
Exactly, yeah. So I just drove a piece of crap for a few years and just slowly, got. And
once you didn't crash it, did you?
I
didn't crash mine. Someone crashed
that one did get that one did get hit. I think it was run into in a parking lot though.
I feel
it actually it was hit hard enough to bend the frame, so we kind of like straightened it out to where it kind of looks all right, but it was basically sold as junk. But
yeah,
it honestly didn't matter. I mean, once you start accumulating years and the cost starts going down for insurance, and it's no big deal there. But
we're still young. They think we're like one bad turn away from a fiery death. So
right.
So
yeah, it is what it is. But yeah, I always enjoyed fixing things. It turned out I got less interested in cars than in tons of other things. So I stripped down and rebuild computers and electronics. I recondition antiques. I do tons of housework. Like I rebuilt a deck outside and then enclosed the space underneath it and turned into a workshop. And I like doing stuff like that. Cars, I tend to just take them to a mechanic I trust.
Now all you need to do is take up the sword, and then you'll be a warrior in a garden, my man. You ever yeah. So all right. Yeah. Enough pleasantries. Back to depressing subjects.
Yeah, back to depressing shit. Okay, so you had asked, you were talking about a response.
Yeah, the response.
I agree with you that a response is needed. The problem is the type of response. And it's ultimately one of the problems that you have with dealing with these kind of extremist movements anywhere in the world. With a terrorist non-state actor, a resistance group like that, when you go in shooting people, you're basically playing whack-a-mole. It's hard enough to get the actual militants themselves. Inevitably, you kill other people, and every innocent you kill increases support for the resistance movement. If you look at Hamas's goals, like what they want, how they govern, 5% of Palestinians like them. They're astonishingly unpopular in terms of their policies. But if you look at support for their fighting back against Israel when Israel is killing civilians, it's quite high. And it's high because of that type of response. So a different type of response is merited when you're dealing with groups like this. I honestly think that a similar model should be pursued to what you got in terms of like Northern Ireland. As long as the British government was saying the IRA needs to disarm and disavow violence before we'll talk to them, they just kept blowing people up. As soon as they said, we're willing to talk to you about your grievances first, then they were willing to disarm. You're never going to get anywhere if you don't address the underlying issues. If we do not address the actual political issues for people, then the violence just keeps going back and forth. And because Israel is far more powerful, it kills far more people every single time. I mean, there's just been repeated incursions into Gaza, in recent years. Just every few years, they send people in or bomb the hell out of it. Every time you're looking at like a couple thousand people killed. It doesn't actually solve the problem. Bibi can say he's going to destroy Hamas's leadership here. It's not possible. You can kill as many terrorists as you want. You're only going to create more until you address the real problem. So yes, I'm with you on response, but a military response against an overwhelmingly impoverished civilian population is just going to create more terror. So it's self-defeating.
Do you think he's going ahead with such a strong attack because like for political reasons, being cynical, trying to make sure he has good election chances? Because like a lot of Israeli news is tearing him apart, and for good reason, right? Like, I mean, a lot of people would see that he sort of failed his like people. So
The
maybe he's
justice
just
reforms
trying
as
to,
well.
do the
Yeah.
9/11 go ahead.
Anytime you get the strong response, it brings people out. Everyone rallies around the flag. Yes, it's great politics in that way, but honestly, he'd do it regardless, because at the end of the day, he leads a hardcore ethno-nationalist party that routinely dehumanizes Palestinians. The U.S. media and just general public discourse on this issue is so different than what you actually get in Israel itself, where we often, intentionally or not, leave out a huge amount of important context. Netanyahu's party, it's the origins of his movement is in a literal 1930s fascist movement in Eastern Europe. People like dressing up in brown shirts and going out and beating up anti-Semites for their own kind of like instead of responding to ethno-nationalism, racism with an anti-racist ideal, which is the left's response to it, and go and beat up the racists, but he responded with an alternative nationalism. And it has remained committed to a hardcore ethnic nationalism ever since. Even if he wanted peace with the Palestinians, he couldn't deliver it because his own party, parties work differently in every country, but that's what parties are generally membership organizations. Ours are two corporations. It's a whole different ballgame. But the members of his party, they get to vote in annual congresses like you have in tons of other countries, right? And his party has voted to annex the West Bank. That's their position. If he presented a peace deal, his party would just split and he'd lose power. It's similar to the way a lot of people talk about Ehud Barak's attempt at a peace deal in 2000. And everyone's like, oh, they offered Arafat a deal and they offered him a state. First off, they didn't. The details are always left out of what they actually offered. I mean, it was essentially a permanent, demilitarized semi-colony. But set that aside. Assume that it was actually a good deal and he wanted it, right? He couldn't have gotten it because Barak was told by his own government that he didn't have the votes for it, that they would simply topple him. If he presented that to a vote in the Knesset, that would be the end of it. So you do have some deeper problems here, right? And at the end of the day, it's a matter of shifting the social and cultural conversation within Israel to affect its politics. And the same thing has to happen on the Palestinian side. They both have to recognize a reason to come together and find an agreement. As long as they don't, and Netanyahu does not think that there is a reason. He thinks he can maintain the iron boot policy indefinitely because that's his politics. He is grown up in and steeped in the politics of the old Irgun and the revisionist Zionist movement and, the old Betar in Eastern Europe. I mean, that's his background. He doesn't look at the Palestinians as potential brothers.
So what version do you think a two-state solution is possible? And if so,
no.
What version of that solution looks the most viable? Favorite word of the day?
Like none of them. I mean, it's been impossible since the 1930s. I mean, the British looked at it and said, no, this can't work then. And the situation is far different now. By the 1980s, it was physically impossible to decouple Israel from the West Bank and Gaza. And it's only deepened since then. The longer we talk in the US about a two-state solution, all we are doing is we are providing cover for indefinite apartheid, for a stateless population, people that literally have no country. The West Bank and Gaza are not legally part of any country on earth. The population is stateless. They're under military occupation. And that's advantageous to Israel to leave it in that, because if they straight up annex it the way a normal country might do it, then they're stuck with the problem of like giving citizenship. And then it's a much more obvious kind of apartheid. It would look much more like South Africa, where, I mean, the Israeli media constantly calls the Israeli government an apartheid state. It fits the definition. We just can't use it here for political reasons. But a two-state solution is physically impossible. It's ecologically impossible. It's infrastructurally impossible. Everything, I mean, like the basic resources for a third of Israel's water supply is being pumped out of West Bank aquifers at this point. The population's already too high for the number of people there. I mean, they're going to have serious problems. And if you divide it up even further, neither country is ultimately viable. So they have to come up with some way to get along. like to recognize both. For me, the closest to a two-state would be the parallel states model, where you have Palestinian and Israeli governments and people can choose which citizenship they want, but they can live wherever they want within it and move around. But it gets very, very complicated. I mean, the closest model you have in history to is you have to go all the way back to like the Ottomans or something. It doesn't fit the way we understand sovereignty today. For me, preferably, I would rather see a constitutional solution. Israel has no constitution. Write one for both peoples that say the country is Israel, Palestine, or Palestine, Israel. Call it whatever you want. You can choose whichever one. It has two flags. You can use whichever one you want. Everyone has equal rights. You take away all the discriminatory shit, which says like, yeah, because there's like Jews only, highways with like your license plates tell you can go in certain areas.
I was about to bring the license plates up.
All kinds of shit like that. Like it's worse than the Jim Crow era. It's a lot like the kind of basic racism you see there is a lot like the US 80 years ago. I've seen signs in shop windows like "We proudly employ no Arabs." Somebody can call up trying to rent an apartment if their Hebrew has a slight Arab accent, they're like, "Oh, sorry, no apartments." Like discrimination is totally legal. Change all of that. Remove all the legal barriers and then let people live where they want to live. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be bumpy for a while, but ultimately people on both sides are attached to parts of the land that they would have no access to in a two-state solution. A unitary state gives them access to all of that. The trick is to make sure everyone's rights are respected. So lock it in constitutionally. The weekend is Friday, Saturday. Jewish holidays are still off, like Yom Kippur, the government shuts down, crap like that. You can still lock in protected status for the population so it gets what we originally wanted with the Zionist ideal, a country of safety, whatever, for the Jews. Like set that up, like lock that in so it can't be changed, but take away all the discrimination. I think it's possible, but the number of people supporting it on the Israeli side are relatively low because in the absence of a constitution, the ethno-national ideology of Zionism has filled the gap. So people think in terms of an ethnic state. Even if you divided the land up, 22% of Israelis are literally Palestinians. What about them? You're stuck with a permanent minority.
So, that was something I was going to mention. I talked to a neighbor of mine who's Palestinian. He was talking about, damn, where I was going to go with this.
I mean, you talked a lot about how, there's a lot of Israeli police and soldiers around in like Palestinian land.
It's, no, it's not that. It was
where are you going?
The parallel solution, there was that. Damn, I lost
The religious
my train of thought.
implications.
Yeah, the religious implication. Oh
the
my
religion
God.
may not allow for the intermarrying.
Do you think that the peace solution can overcome that? Because the thing he told us, thank you so much for reminding me. The thing he told us is that there is a belief amongst Palestinians and Israelis that if Palestine and Israel, come to peace, the world will end. And I don't know if you believe in that or not, but that seems like a hell of a barrier to overcome for peace.
It's not much of one in the area, though. It's not the one people point to. Like for a lot of Israelis, the barrier to a one state or parallel states model is much more demographic fears. The fact that they would no longer be an overwhelming majority, they'd be half the population, and that they would feel uncomfortable in that. It's just the nationalism at the end of the day. The religious issue appeals in those kind of extremes largely to very small minorities on the other side, because you have extreme, religious bigots like Hamas that massively misinterpret their scriptures, and you have extreme bigots. There are rabbis arguing that it's totally okay to like rape and murder Palestinians and shit like this because they're an inferior people according, whatever. So people can come up with things like that, but that doesn't appeal to most people. At the end of the day, it's a fringe ideology. One of the key issues affecting international politics, though, is Christian Zionism. And this is one of the reasons that the US is actually committed to an Israeli ethno-state, is because a significant chunk of American Protestant Christians need a state called Israel to exist in the area, so there can be an apocalypse and, most of the Jews can get killed and the last 100,000 convert and blah, blah, blah. It's essentially like a genocidal fantasy. It's genuinely horrifying as a reason to support anybody. Like, we're going to support you because we want you all to die. but it is a reality in this country. It while a lot of actual voters and supporters, like actual evangelical Christians, don't think in those terms, their pastors do. They might just not know the details of why their church is saying we're all super pro-Israel. That's again true of most people. Most people don't know the details of any religion that we're in, but it does affect our support and the way we lean on Israel. But it's not as much an issue internally with Israel. Most Palestinians and most Israelis are actually very, very secular people.
I mean, I hope so, because very gatekeeping peace behind the literal end of all humanity is such what was the term, doom cult, death cult type thinking, and it is very worrying in that sense. So I guess this is something, I don't know if you would feel comfortable answering it, but it's something that we were debating last time was what was Hamas hoping to achieve with this attack?
Yeah,
and I don't mean in like the news media, like they're trying to kill babies and no, none of that. I mean, like I speculated that maybe they're trying to drum up support from the Islamic/Arabic world, but that's kind of a precursory glance. I wanted to get your input. What do you think Hamas was trying to achieve with this large-scale offensive?
One is to slow down the process of normalization with Israel. Tons of the Arab states in the region have for decades wanted peace because they want to use the Israeli economy as a motor for the whole region. They can get like investors, and you can have like people opening up factories in the other countries, and it could improve the quality of life for everybody. I mean, the Saudi Arabia is super rich, but it's a peripheral economy. It's still dependent upon petrochemicals. It does not have a diversified economy. Israel is a fully diversified economy, and the expertise needed to actually help a lot of those states. They've all wanted this for a long time. They've held out because of the Palestine issue and the way that plays on the Arab street, right? The way it affects popular opinion in their own countries. More and more of them are willing to set that aside, sometimes for their own realpolitik reasons, like Morocco stepped up to do it because we basically sold out Western Sahara for them. We recognized their annexation, so they can normalize with Israel. But others are doing it because they ultimately would rather improve their own economic standing. They want to like fix things there, and they're willing to give up on the Palestine issue. If Hamas can provoke Israel to commit more of the atrocities that it does, because every time Israel is provoked, I mean, there's no nice way around that. And honestly, I despise the media about this stuff. They talk about, you'll see the word atrocity applied to what Hamas does, but you never, ever see it when you're talking about the bombing of civilian areas afterwards. Like the death toll is always much higher among civilians for what Israel does, but we just don't use the same language. But Hamas knows that. They know they will go over the top because they've been doing it for decades. And more people killed will affect popular opinion in the Arab world, and that might slow down the process of normalization. It's to their advantage politically to delay any of that, to stretch it out, because then they lose any possible base of support. If those countries are fully normalized with Israel, it makes it a lot harder for them to interact with the populations in those areas, raise funds, support their own causes. So it's a very cynical calculation, and they know it is going to kill Palestinian civilians. This is at the end of the day the problem with governments in general, and why I tend to dislike them, because Hamas and Israel are both willing to take decisions that are going to kill innocents for political reasons. Hamas's decision here is quite calculated, and they know it will cause suffering on their own side, but they think it's what they need to do in the long run.
One thing, one bit of rhetoric I've always taken umbrage with, because I actually didn't really know about it until more recently, was the human shields rhetoric. I didn't know that Israel moved its civilians basically right next to the border wall. That's like if South Korea had a whole city on the DMZ line,
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a provocation. Like there was no way for them to fight back without hitting civilians, without there being casualties.
That's honestly been done from the beginning. Okay, so I'll give you a short example going back to the 1950s, right? So we're not sure like where the border is going to be between like Syria and Israel, after the 1948 war. So there's a DMZ, and the Syrians and the Israelis interpreted the demilitarized zone differently. Israel, I mean, the Syrians said, well, this is like no man's land. We haven't decided who gets it. We'll figure it out later. No one goes into it. The Israelis turned it over to civilians. They sent tractors in. They started farming it. And they did it deliberately, going all the way up toward the border. And, eventually, like, a soldier's going to get nervous and take a shot at somebody. And if you take a pot shot, then they respond with artillery. I mean, the UN did a study afterwards of like just dozen skirmishes that happened over and over again, and found out that the Israelis were directly culpable for nearly all of them because of the use of civilians cynically that way. So when they often point to the fact that Hamas uses human shields, Hamas will put their weapons below a school or something. Okay, sure, they do that. Resistance movements always have to use whatever they can to hide shit. They're using human shields. So does Israel. It always has. It has since it has since before the existence of the state. Go back to mandatory Palestine, and they're unconsciously spreading their population as thinly as possible into as many areas because that gives them a chance of making a land claim in those areas. But it knows, depending on how the fighting breaks out, if you're heavily outnumbered, so think about the massacre that happened to the small Jewish population in Hebron, in the initial split in 47, 48. Those guys were sacrificed because they were put into an area that was heavily urbanized already by Palestinians. It's always been a cynical tactic.
So that there's another thing that kind of interests us, I guess. That would interest you. What do you think about the leftist response? Because I don't know if you ever heard of the streamer Hassan Piker.
Piker, yeah, I've heard of him. I don't generally have time for a lot of the shows, but I know of a lot of people. Yeah.
Well, you see, you work for a living, right? But
I can do these things, but I can't listen to all of them all the time. Yeah,
so he said something very interesting. He said that the settlers are not civilians, and that attitude is permeating the left. And what do you think that's hurting?
It's it's problematic in a number of ways, and in some ways it actually reminds me of the way that you can even take it out of the left and just look at the mainstream rhetoric you get out of Democrats and Republicans on issues like this too. It often is basically using like Al-Qaeda's logic. I mean, Al-Qaeda struck at the World Trade Center because we get to vote and we choose a government that is aggressively imperialistic in other areas. They want them out. So since we didn't vote those governments out and change those policies, we're culpable. That's the basic logic here. And yeah, you can say, Israel conscripts tons of people, so people have to serve in the military, so they're not totally civilians. Almost everyone has to serve 1 to 3 years out of high school, but it's not their choice either. That it's conscription. So clearly they are civilians, regardless of whether they're a reservist or something. What you end up doing is blaming people for government policies of putting them in harm's way and building the settlements in the first place.
A part of the reasoning was because they are settlers, as he calls them, that even that the children are settlers. All of them are settlers. It was the rhetoric that I believe was it.
Where do you draw the line? I mean, Israel as a country is a settler colony. Just like Australia and Canada and the US, people moved, took over land, and settled on it. So, I mean, okay, you can make an ethical argument for the Lakota Sioux to be shooting people in the Dakotas still, but does that really solve the problem? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter where you're drawing the line. The settlements in the West Bank, sure, they're illegal, but the underlying ethical problem with them is no different than that built around the original state and its exclusionary policies toward the non-Jewish citizen body. I mean, Israel dispossesses people and seizes land from actual citizen Israeli Palestinians. It's still like even if you leave the West Bank and Gaza out of it, Israel would still be an apartheid state because of the way it treats that 22% of its population. So it still thinks like a settler colony. That's why I said I prefer a constitutional solution, because without that, people have been left to default to a 19th century ethno-nationalism as the key ideology of the state. And that shit's dangerous. I mean, that's what had us out there like massacring Native Americans in the 19th century. I mean, it's what had all these wars in late 19th and early 20th century Europe are built around like nationalist causes. It's going to be a problem. So, yeah, I don't. For me personally, any like non-direct combatant should be off limits. This is why I feel confident calling out Hamas as a violent organization and the Israeli state for their actions. Whenever anybody targets a civilian, it's over the line for me.
You might get hate mail from that because there seems to be a pretty, I mean, it's far like sort of fringe, but it's still somewhat prominent.
Hassan's a large figure.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the biggest political streamers on Twitch.
But
they seem to just like brush aside the death of Israelis.
I know. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And I understand the ethical argument. I mean, in some way, it's like the entire 20th century anti-colonial struggle. You know, at the end of the day, there is a principled ethical argument for resistance. It's hilarious to me to look at a country like the US that was literally founded in resistance to a government over tyranny of taxes, and then has over and over and over again in the last century and a half defended the imperial powers and attacked the people who wanted independence. I mean, what the hell were we doing in Vietnam? We got involved to support French colonialism and started paying for their war so they could hold on to it. We supported all the imperial powers and none of the anti-colonial struggles, even though we started as a colony and should be able to relate to it. So in ethical terms, yeah, you can look at what any Palestinian resistance movement does and say, okay, it's terrorism by definition, but it's also resistance to occupation and tyranny. And in that way, make an argument. And you know, I can see where people go with that, because in any kind of struggle like that, I mean, look like the Algerian War of Independence against France. Civilians died in it. You know, it happened. I personally don't like that. It goes back to the question you asked earlier about engagement with the political process. I would rather find ways to avoid violence. I understand the rationales for it. I understand the ethical arguments around it. My preference is pacifism wherever possible. But I always temper that, because at the end of the day, when you're facing massive injustice, the pacifist position is often acquiescence to tyranny, which is why I will never tell somebody they don't have a right to fight back. They absolutely do. Anybody has a right to defend their home. Anybody has a right to fight back. But Hamas's fighting back should not be blowing up buses. It should not be shooting up music festivals. You know, there are other ways to do this.
So there's one last piece to this whole puzzle that eludes me still. Egypt's position. It's weird that Egypt would only take on 2,000 people, but it seems like, at least in rhetoric, Egypt's kind of committed to the Palestinians. Why do you think they're so wishy-washy on committing to especially to the humanitarian corridor, for example?
In part, it's because of the way that the relationship works. The core of the relationship between Egypt and Israel is military and intelligence services. A lot of their relationships are directly with the military, similar to ours. Like our deal where we give them guns every year, just like we give the Israelis guns, it goes to the military, not the government. Right? There's some close relationships there. In a sense, you're dealing with what we can kind of loosely call a deep state. You know, like the more shadowy elements of their government. That side, they have a common interest in containing these movements. Egypt is a kind of classic Arab republic in the sense of a secular dictatorship that opposes any kind of militant movement, largely because the single biggest target of all these Islamist movements has been other Muslims, has been those governments trying to topple the secular governments. So Egypt has spent decades calling people terrorists and crushing them. Ergo, it does not like Hamas. Hamas will be a wild card. They don't want people like that. They're constantly fighting terrorists in their own country. So they'd rather cooperate with the Israelis in maintaining this giant outdoor prison because it suits their own interests. A massive influx of Palestinians could destabilize them. You can take some historical examples of that too. Because it's one thing to take in people, but when the people do have militants among them, or people already sympathetic to it who can be recruited as militants, right? It has a destabilizing potential. uh, Jordan actually had a civil war over this because the Palestinians started organizing themselves under the auspices of the different militant organizations and created a state within a state. And it got to be so much of a threat that they ended up having to fight. When that leadership was expelled, the people didn't leave. The leadership left. Where did the leadership go? Lebanon. They did exactly the same thing. They organized the Palestinians in those areas. They started organizing the descendants of those refugees. Next thing you know, a state within a state. And while it's not a cause, it is a contributing factor leading to the Lebanese civil war that broke out in 76. Egypt knows that large numbers of Palestinians could have a destabilizing effect on their own fragile politics. And Sisi is a dictator at the end of the day. He needs to find a way to prop himself up. And if you get in a movement like that, they can help organize people. They can contribute experience and knowledge and even weapons to Egyptian groups that oppose him. Do you see where I'm going there? These regimes are mostly concerned with self-preservation.
So there's no way you could see the Americans greasing the wheels, maybe shooting the Egyptians some money to. I mean, I know I'm half joking. I know I'm half joking, but
anything's possible, but I don't think that it's likely because it actually would be considered an internal threat in Egypt. It would be problematic for them to bring in large numbers of people. Not to mention they would need a ton of aid because where the hell are you going to put them? I mean, the entire border area is the Sinai Peninsula, which is a blasted gray wasteland of nothing. I mean, it does not support much human life. You can't bring another million people into it. So it would be a humongous humanitarian issue. But at the end of the day, that's the Palestinian refugee crisis in a nutshell. You've got millions of people living in terrible conditions, whether they're in Lebanon, Syria. There are Palestinians, there are descendants from the 48 war still living in Egypt today. There are refugee descendants living all over the Arab world. None of them are happy to be there. And all of them are trapped in a situation because no one actually wants to support them. The Arab regimes are all using them cynically as pawns in geopolitics. So are the Western countries. And the Israelis are not willing to fairly negotiate any kind of final status solution here. So everyone's just sort of stuck decade after decade.
Oh, this is a bit of a off tangent, but this is something I'm kind of wondering out of how is it that a terrorist organization like ISIS basically gets bombed into non-existence, but groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, they've been able to stay around for so long? Like, how does that happen? How does the biggest power in the Arab world become basically nothing, while there's so many other groups so similar to them?
Well, the whole issue with Daesh was that while it was still a terror group, it was difficult to deal with. I mean, it has its origins in a radical fringe that broke up, that started in Jordan, right? It's been around for a while. But they took advantage of the wars in Iraq and then Syria to actually seize control of territory and try to create governing institutions. And that means we treat them like a government, which of course means carpet bombing and everything else. I mean, tons of civilians were killed in the process. Honestly, this is one of the saddest things about a lot of our relations with countries in the area. Some of the fighters that did the best and did the most good in terms of stopping Daesh in the area were actually Iraqi militias and the Iranians. And then we just shit all over them for it. Completely ignore the fact that they have an interest in stopping these militant movements too. And then, we can beat our chest. We defeated the terrorists. No, the most of the fighting was actually by a bunch of Shia militias and Iranians and Kurds and tons of other forces on the ground organizing themselves to fight back against these movements. But they were able to fight them essentially like two armies because Daesh controlled territory. Hamas does not. It has a deep civilian infrastructure because it's also like schools and clinics and soup kitchens and all kinds of basic social goods there. And then it has a militia. Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is not just for anybody watching this, they often get mixed into this stuff. Hezbollah has nothing to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict. Ultimately, they're a Lebanese Shia movement, and they organized to initially resist the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and then B, stayed active because they wanted to increase Shia representation in Lebanon's very flawed democracy. because they had the largest chunk of the population and the least power. But Hezbollah is a political party. They're literally a legal movement that has a militia. So it's how do you deal with that? On some level, it's back to like, well, I guess we can bomb Lebanon, but that doesn't solve the problem either. They've tried that. So the simple answer is you could go after groups like Daesh because they departed from the model of a resistance movement. A lot of these groups, like the terrorist groups in the area, they're very similar to the way that people organize themselves in the anti-colonial period, like as separate cells. Not everyone knows each other. The weapons are all dispersed and spread around. People often don't know things. Americans were so like, we got to get bin Laden and stop bin Laden. Bin Laden didn't give orders. He wasn't like directly leading anything. The dude was just like hiding out somewhere and like writing speeches and shit. It was a completely decentralized movement where people are able to act on their own. Hamas has an official like governing institute, like a political branch, and frequently what's happening in Gaza has nothing to do with them. They're like, what the fuck happened? Like they're often like not on the same page, because resistance movements organized against great powers, again, just as in the anti-colonial struggle, they have to be decentralized to survive. Otherwise, they're easy to stamp out.
So I think the last thing I'll ask about Palestine and Israeli conflict is the role of misinformation. Seems like a lot of it's being rolled out. I don't know if you've seen it, but a special flavor of it is using video game footage and passing it along as combat footage.
There's a lot of misinformation, and like people will bring up stuff like it'll be Palestinian children that are killed, but then they're like, it's an Israeli child. There's also the game footage. It's like, look at all these
out of date footage too.
Yeah, out of date footage. And like, how
do you sift through all this misinformation? How do you make sure what you're seeing is real on the ground?
That's a $20,000 question right there. There are a lot of groups that actually do a good job of vetting this material, of tracking down where it goes. There's just tons of really good international organizations that do stuff like this. And I love like following and supporting groups that collect this kind of information. I mean, Popular Front's reporting from war areas, or like Bellingcat studying like the white supremacist type movements. I mean, they go through and they do a deep dive to try and verify what's happening. But most people don't know that. Think about I think you made a reference to decapitated babies early on, right? Like the story starts with one Israeli officer telling one person, showing them nothing, but saying it. And then it's just picked up and breathlessly repeated over and over and over again. And at this point, it's impossible to stop. It's going to be repeated for decades now. Do you remember when Hamas decapitated 40 babies? Meanwhile, zero evidence, and the Israeli state was finally forced to admit, yeah, we've got no evidence this happened. But it starts with a rumor. It starts with one nationalist asshole who wants to say something sensationalist. And because of the way our media sphere works, it spreads around very quickly. It's ultimately not a huge departure from the way that rumors always spread. I mean, people always believed the most inane bullshit, but it used to move more slowly. Technology just speeds up the whole process, and gets it in people's faces faster. And once there's a ton of memes and articles and everything else, how do you get rid of it? There's no good way to counter it. And a lot of the problem with anything like this, it's very similar to the problem with conspiracy theories. Approaching any of this stuff with reason tends not to work. Over and over again, you can address that question. Okay, empirically speaking, we have no support for the idea of 40 decapitated babies, so you're going to stop saying it, right? No. And then they say it again because it means something to them. It serves a particular emotional purpose. It moved them. It frightened them. Fear and anger are powerful motivators, and they dig deep ruts in our brain, and we want to keep returning to these things. So it's one of the bigger problems with any conflict like this. And this is why, again, I hate a lot of the reductive narratives. Oh, we just need to like negotiate, draw a little line with a Sharpie, two-state solution, everything will be fine. We ignore the fact that more than a century of the separation of the peoples has created significant cultural issues, tons of hatreds, tons of racisms. Palestinians did not used to be racist towards Jews. A lot of them now are. They straight up imported European anti-Semitic rhetoric that never existed in the Middle East before. They took it right out of European, Christian narratives. But they have a reason to believe it emotionally, because their lived experience is sniper towers and razor wire from the Israelis. So of course, somebody saying this shit, it means something to them, right? You can't go and say, well, no, factually speaking, all this anti-Semitic stuff in the 19th century is fake, because you still aren't dealing with the emotional concern people have. I'm sorry I'm rambling a bit here, but a lot of these issues are interrelated. In some way, it gets back to one of the points we made earlier when we were talking about politics, right? I said, go directly to people and talk to them. Hear their concerns. If you can hear the actual emotional concerns of somebody who on paper should totally disagree with you, and you are sympathetic to those concerns, you can find the underlying causes, then sometimes you can get past, all the bullshit rhetoric that's piled on top that separates people. But it's very difficult to do that. And we live in a world that wants fast answers, sound bites, like little clips or whatever there, and you don't want to do that work. So those narratives, once they take hold, they're extremely powerful. And yeah, how ultimately to stop that? God, it's one of the reasons I got into studying extremist movements in the first place, like the political psychology of extremist movements. Like, how do you unpack that shit? The fact that we are still recycling, like, Bircher narratives from the 1950s and 60s today that were factually inaccurate then, or that people are still citing, like, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Tsarist Russian forgery from 1905, literally a forgery. We know it's a forgery. We know where it came from. It's still there. How do you get rid of it?
And knowing it sounds like the Palestinian, especially like the citizens, have their back against the wall. And I was just wondering, how do you see the conflict going on for the next couple of decades?
Because Netanyahu did say to prepare for a long war.
Yeah. Like, how do you see the next couple, decades playing out?
Well, on some level, and this is one of the problems, I think, in terms of framing, the war never stopped. When Israelis and Palestinians started fighting in 1947, that was never actually resolved. There is still an existing conflict for them, and they've lived under horrific conditions ever since. So it's not like this isn't daily news. We just tend to ignore it in the US, in the same way that most Israelis do. I've literally taken Israelis into the West Bank and showed them entire communities living in a walled-in area surrounded by razor wire and towers, like this is your life, and they've never seen it. Like, they have no idea what it's really like, because they just don't go there, and their media doesn't want to talk about it. Same as ours, or some of the media does, but like just normal stuff. Like, people just want to go on with their lives. You don't want to think about all this awful shit that's going on in the world, right? So yeah, Netanyahu could say whatever he wants, and the fight can continue for quite a long time, but there's not a huge change for the people on the ground on the Palestinian side. For them, it's just more of the same. How is this different from the incursions in 15 years ago? Like, what really is the difference for them? See, the short answer to like your bigger question, like, where do I see things going? I see no possibility of change yet. I know what we could do that could grease the wheel, so to speak, and push us in the right direction, but I see no signs that anyone's willing to do it. And until people are, it's just going to go on and on and on, as it has since the 1880s.
Tell me, Liam, how to grease the wheel, solve the Middle East for us.
Yeah.
Well, part of it is giving up the fantasy that you can divide this land, because there's two competing national identities that are both romantically attached to it. Palestinians have known for centuries that they live in Palestine. Like, the term goes back to the Romans. They knew where they are. Everyone's rooted to their home. And this fantasy a lot of Americans have, well, Arabs are just Arabs. Like, no, like Egyptian Arabic and Moroccan Arabic, they're not mutually intelligible, with Palestinian Arabic. Arabic is a language family, not a single language. And the cultures are different, food's different, lifestyles, climate, everything. They live where they live. So we have to recognize that both peoples have a right to live in the same place. So first step, it's a paradigm shift, understanding that you cannot have it all. Palestinians cannot have a whole Palestine with no Jews. Israelis cannot have, a whole Israel with no Palestinians. It's not going to happen. Once you can accept that, you can actually start the physical aspects of negotiating a settlement, but you have to change here first and here. You have to change the basic mindset, the basic beliefs, in order to be able to humanize the other, to recognize their common claim to humanity and dignity, and then have the conversation. For us, one of the grease the wheel sort of aspects, Americans need to drop the fantasy of a two-state solution, because all it does is it gives cover to far-right governments to keep doing what they're doing. It just drags it out. It is intentionally designed to slow it down. The entire Oslo process, the peace process they started, those negotiations at the beginning of the 90s, that was a scam. During the 1990s, while they were negotiating, the settler population doubled. Massive construction all through the decade. The whole point was to stretch it out, to establish facts on the ground, to change the status quo in a way that advantaged them. If we stop talking about that, we can start forcing them to face the real reality, that they can't cling to this idea that someday they'll be able to come up with a magic map that'll make everybody happy and it'll all be over. Because the way Israel is currently structured, the Zionist mentality within Israel is never going to tolerate a separate state anyway. Every proposal has always been completely demilitarized, Israel controlling their borders and their airspace. No people is going to be happy in that permanently. It's essentially what the South Africans did with the Bantu stance. They created like fictional independent African homelands. There, we pointed to it and said, yeah, we know this is fictional. With Israel, we keep giving them a free pass, and we pretend these little cantonments they're creating in the West Bank are not Bantu stance, but they are. If we drop that, if we get our politicians to give up that bullshit, and that's a hard part there. That takes a major political shift. That takes a lot of voters getting a clue and pushing their existing politicians or replacing them. But if our government stops supporting this nonsense of support Israel no matter what it does, and a two-state solution will eventually magically happen, then Israel will have to accept that its status quo is untenable. Think back to like the South Africa issue just briefly, right? Why did it last as long as it did? It had international support. That government eventually collapsed because enough countries started pulling out. They started cutting off economic relations. It couldn't survive without that. The outside world does have a part to play here. And if we recognize the shared humanity of both sides, and we say they both have a claim, they both have rights to live here, then we can flip the narrative in Israel itself. We can force them to start having that conversation that they're trying desperately to avoid.
Honestly, I think that's probably the most interesting take I've heard on Israel thus far on a solution, because by the way you made it sound, the two-state solution, like that is actually a position I've heard a bit, that the two-state solution really is just dragging out the conflict. The longer, the longer there's this push, like you said, like no side's going to be happy with the conditions, and I think you touched on it earlier, but like it's physically impossible, especially for Palestine. They don't have land to farm and water, so that is a good point.
It was literally designed as a fiction, and people pointed it out at the time. There were a ton of people noting the whole purpose of the negotiations here and saying this is what's going to happen here, and it was right. It was shockingly obvious if it was really paying attention, but it's played out exactly the way everyone said. And the fact that we want desperately to believe the lie. We want desperately to believe that an ethno-national state is justified in the area, and that somehow magically they will find a way to agree with the Palestinians and give them something, and they'll be happy with it. It's never going to happen. And until we accept that that can't work, this conflict will go on indefinitely. As long as Israel has support for what it needs to do, they're doing the same basic thing we are. They're slowly removing their own freedoms. They've been whittling away their own civil liberties. Putting more restrictions on NGOs and on publications, all kinds of shit there. As long as this conflict goes on, the more of that you're going to see too. And it'll just get more and more tyrannical. But as long as it has the international support and the fiction of an eventual peace, there's no reason for them to stop. There's no reason for them to stop and have the hard internal conversation about this. The left in Israel has been wanting to do it for years. I've interacted with tons of people on the Israeli left that want to have those kind of conflicts. And there are small parties in the Knesset that are mixed, that have Israeli and Palestinian delegates. They understand how this could work in the long run. But they are a tiny share of the electorate because the dominant narrative is supported internationally. We need to pull that rug out so that they can start having the internal conversation they need, or they're never going to find peace.
Sounds like you need to run for the president's office. Sounds like you might need to bring the ideas there.
I mean, it's a good way to get shot, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm about to say, don't do it. No,
it's an honor. It's an honor to be shot.
It's suicide by 3 bullets to the back of the head.
There's but so, I mean, you don't get people from inside the system that really want to talk about geopolitics the way scholars can. We get to study the systems. We get to take the view from 10,000 feet. We get to step back and see how all the pieces work, how it's played out over time, and you can see what's going to work there. People inside a system have to work within the logic of the system. I understand why the State Department does what it does. I understand why the Biden administration says what it does. It really can't do anything else, because that's how the cards were dealt in the first place. It does take a lot of shuffling around. No matter, you can get one person on top there, and it's all. If I was president, I still couldn't change the things, because all of the inertia within all of these institutions would still be based on an ultimately nonsensical ideology. So we're able to analyze it, but to change something that big, no, but I get it was a joke.
A successful Bernie presidency would just be 4 years of him just slowing the ball down then. Huh?
Well, one of the things, okay, so with Bernie, there's an interesting possibility. So the way I often describe the way things have played out over the last 50, 60 years in the US is you get Republicans in and there's a steady decline in our living standards, right? And then you get Democrats in there and it kind of flatlines or declines a little bit still, or there's a little bump, slight changes. But most of the improvements in the last 50 years, even when Democrats are in, are at the top 10%, and mostly the top 1%. Even under Democrats, most of us have seen our living standards decline, but it's slower under them. So it kind of does this. With Bernie, there might have been a bump up. If he'd managed to get some legislation, it might have pushed back a little bit. At the end of the day, people can, if you actually have those conversations, and this is something that the presidency has a unique capacity for, in some ways larger. Think about FDR's fireside chat sort of model, right? What Bernie was doing on the campaign was actually normalizing a new way of thinking about issues. And if that changes the way the base conceives of things, if you, for example, got a lot of Americans to understand that reducing poverty is good for all of us, that if there are fewer poor people, even the middle class people are going to be better off, so it's worth it to spend that money. If you can change that idea, then you can get the legislation through. So yeah, it's not going to rocket up, but there'd be the potential of finally reversing that decline if you got the right kind of person in. This is why I can be a bit optimistic, even though it doesn't look good about it ever working, but there are potentials. It could work. You could actually turn this around, but it's not going to happen until we change, and we change who we support, and we start pushing things along.
So you're saying we're declining like Rome then?
Well, I mean, yeah, if you want to think of it that way, sure. I mean,
No, I know. I figure
I
a
mean,
lot of
no,
history nerds make that reference.
I get it. Especially the deeper you look, some of the parallels get interesting because there were a lot of factors affecting Rome's decline. Um, most of the factors are not the same, but the fact that it took a long time, that people didn't see it happen, that's very similar. I mean, long after, I mean, you've got okay, so tons of people have moved in. I don't know if you know any Roman history, but you were making like a lot of these Germanic peoples like federati. They were like partly Roman, but partly not. They had some autonomy, but they had to serve in the military and pay taxes or whatever. But they were frequently abused because Rome still felt it was like the big dog and could throw its weight around. So it was constantly like, lashing out violently, or it would break its treaty obligations the way we did to Native Americans, right? And all of that accelerated the decline. And the big factor there is that Romans themselves did not see just how fucked they were. And I think Americans don't either. I think Americans want to think we're the greatest, most powerful country on earth, and they do not understand. I mean, that, yeah, land of the free is down to 62nd place in the world for freedom. We are in sharp decline as a society, and people haven't noticed yet. That, I think, is the single biggest parallel with Rome, is the blindness that people have to the systemic factors dragging us down. Sorry, that's another long-winded answer.
No. I mean,
I
it
babble
was
a lot.
A joke ended in a lesson, so it worked.
Yeah.
So, my friend here really likes the Mongols. So there's a question I gotta ask: what stopped the Mongols from conquering Europe?
Different terrain, no? Was the terrain
No.
difference? No.
No, it's not military at all. It's political. The short version of this is that the Mongol model, what we can call like a military patronage state, it's based on a pastoral nomadic lifestyle. So the Khan would have like 1,000 horses, and then if he has 3 sons that survive, then when he dies, that gets divided up, and everyone gets like 300 some horses, and then they can either pledge support to one of the brothers as like the great Khan above them and link up, sort of, or they can go off and be their own thing. But the division process was never dropped when they started conquering territory. So every single generation, the only thing that held it together was all of the people who inherited had to agree that somebody officially was in charge of everybody. But de facto, it was actually a dozen independent states. And the longer it went on, the more political infighting that showed up. It got harder and harder to agree on who was in charge. So it lost its momentum.
So Genghis Khan lived forever and kept it going, kept the whole boat up,
Yeah, if you're like a vampire immortal or something, sure, but like it's the social model.
What like Civ. Like
later, like the same basic social model existed for Turks as Mongols, because they're from the same basic area. They were pastoral nomads, right? Most of the early Turkic states, as they started migrating out and creating states, most of them collapsed for exactly the same reason. They'd survive for 100 years and then they'd pull themselves apart because they didn't fully adapt to the way things would work in a settled state. The handful that did well, like the Ottomans and the Mughal Empire in India and whatnot, are ones that adapted and created a centralized bureaucratic state and, like passing power to a single heir and things like that. They had to adapt from that military patron state model. The Mongols never managed to do that. I mean, they may have in the long run, if they could have thought of something, if they were beginning the process of having conversations, they were starting to rebuild cities, but it just didn't work out that way.
Their greatest strength was also their weakness.
Yeah, I mean exactly. Being a very mobile, very effective military force isn't enough. You need the tax revenue to support military expansion, and you need stable political leadership to actually have those goals. And they entirely lacked both of them.
So now I know why the oldest son gets everything. You got to stop the division somewhere.
At least in Europe. I mean, it's not the only model, obviously. I mean, the Ottomans, had one inherit, but it could be any of them
who survived all the killing, right?
Yeah, who kind of like had the most support among the military and the bureaucracy, who was like the most effective, right? But it wasn't the birth lottery of who was born first.
Wasn't
for a state to survive? This is the problem for states in general. Governments need to have some kind of succession method, and a lot of models fail in that way. is a fun parallel with a lot of the current issues we deal with in the world today to the Mongol question. Fascism lacks a proper succession mechanism because it focuses on like the charismatic leaders, right? What happens when the leader dies? Franco died, Spain became a democracy again. It's very difficult for somebody to inherit that mantle. So it's a similar like drawback. Like you have to find some kind of model that works, or ultimately you're always going to fail politically. The Mongols failed politically, not militarily.
That's an interesting take. Like I've never really heard it explained in that way, especially just like in online documentaries. Like
it's always about how badass they were. So
yeah,
like God,
it's similar to the Romans in that way. I mean, the Romans were great ass kickers militarily, but their biggest problem was actually economic. They had an extremely weak economy that was based upon agriculture, slave agriculture. They literally had steam engines. They knew how steam worked, but they could never actually develop it technologically, turn it into something very useful. It was basically like toys for kids because they had slave labor. The dependence upon it's similar like why did the U.S. North industrialize so much more rapidly and urbanize more rapidly? The South stayed a slave society. So it was agrarian, which meant it had a weaker economic base. The South lost the Civil War for economic reasons. They couldn't afford a longer war. It's always going to bite you in the ass. The biggest problem Rome always had was that it had greater ambitions than it had an economy to support. And ideologically, it couldn't imagine changing its economy. But most of our discussion, I get it. Yeah, in popular culture, all the YouTube shows, everyone wants to talk about badass soldiers. Yeah, the legions kicked ass. But there has to be enough money in the society to support it all. And there just never was. So you're just sucking more and more tax revenue out of people, devaluing currencies, everything else. Eventually, it all collapses.
God, I could do this all day, but we gotta get to the last subject. I mean, I look, when you have a PhD, when you have a doctor to talk to, you almost want to just sit and ask questions, but we can't though. Because there's one last subject we got to talk about, the CFA, the California Faculty Association. And last I checked, they're in fact finding, right? Or negotiation. So can you tell me about some of the key issues? Do you know what's going on with that?
This time around, I'm honestly trying to stay a little bit out of it, especially since I get very passionate about union issues anyway. So as far as I'm concerned, the way that we're paid in general is crap. And they've been slowly undermining higher education in this country for several decades now. I mean, 3/4 of classes in this country are taught by part-timers with no job security at all and relatively low pay. To get to an income that's at least remotely comparable to a starting income in the old tenured model where more people got that, I have to teach 9 classes at 3 campuses, which means I'm driving 35,000 miles a year. And it's just tons of like shit that goes into that. It wears people down. It is a completely bankrupt system and it needs massive structural changes. But all we're trying to do is apply band-aids. Like, how can we increase pay a little bit here? So I get that. And one of the big sticking points is trying to give us a raise, right? Actually help people out. And they don't want to do it. They want to sit on a massive pool of cash. They have a pretty big kitty just sitting there that they don't want to touch on. And they'd rather spend more money on really expensive administrators and, high-tech projects and building and things like that. Where for me, education is about the students. I honestly it's funny, I had a conversation about this very recently, so excuse a very short tangent, but higher education was actually started by a collaboration between students and teachers. And the degrees, you mentioned the doctoral degree, was literally created by student guilds. They wanted to make sure the master's and the doctorate came about because they wanted to make sure the people teaching them had a freaking clue. They didn't want like some Yahoo out there like, oh yeah, I totally know what I'm talking about, and just bullshitting them. So you wanted certain qualifications. It was insisted upon by the students. Early universities were run more collaboratively. I would prefer a model more like that, where the education is based on what the educators and the students need Instead, it's too directed by all this administration type shit. But it's, I don't know, as far as the actual fight that we're dealing with here, whatever they end up doing, I'm I'll be fine. I'll do whatever. But if I would honestly kind of prefer they struck. But I just kind of take knee jerk view that for anything. I prefer when we had a much more active labor movement in this country.
I mean,
Go back to like the 1870s, 1880s, and when workers were willing to fight back against the bosses, things improved much more rapidly when we had strong unions. So from like the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century, living standards kept going up and up and up because workers were willing to fight bosses. When we stopped doing that, they lost the incentive to actually pay us and decided to keep more and more of it for themselves. And sadly, that has filtered into education in the last few decades, the basic business model.
I mean, seems like it's been a pretty good summer for labor. Seems like the labor movement's starting to,
Yeah.
Would you say it's starting to be revived?
Some of it is, and I hope that a lot of that energy continues. I'm most excited by a lot of the smaller, newer unions, like the Amazon labor union, the Starbucks union, because they're not connected to the big the big traditional organizations that are too tied into a political status quo. A lot of the unions that actually had very radical politics for a long time get kind of stuck. I mean, this is a problem with my old union in the port. ILWU used to fight the bosses, and they were really militant about it. But the last really significant strike, it's around when I was born. I mean, like it goes back into the 70s. It's been very difficult since then. Like it's gotten harder and harder for them to push back. And one of the factors we have, especially since the 1980s, is that a lot of the working population align with conservative parties that ultimately hate unions. So they love the higher pay of being in a union, but they keep voting for people who are undermining unions and keeping wages low. And that conflict in basic consciousness, it traps the unions. So they know that they can't push harder because their own membership will oppose it. So it's more exciting for me to see young people out there creating their own unions and pushing back, because you don't have those much, you don't have any of that politics in the background there. You can actually fight. And in the long run, that might inspire a lot of the old unions to get some of their fire back and start, preaching again to their members, because the way unions worked is the unions themselves used to talk. They used to do worker education that was effective. The culture wars since the 70s and 80s have really complicated that immensely.
Well, we've had this. What you want to?
I was gonna ask. So, like, how do you feel about like our leaders and how they respond to like Newsom saying no to unemployment for strikers? Like,
do you think Newsom has been a help or a hindrance to the labor movement? Because arguably California is the epicenter for it right now. He is potentially at the leader of the biggest labor state in the entire union. So, like, do you think he's hindering it, or do you think he's helping it, or is it wish-washy?
No, Newsom's a neoliberal. I mean, he's not going to be on the side of workers and things like this. He's on the side of business in the same way as Biden is. They will make pro-union statements because that's part of the voting base, but their actual actions when it comes to, putting your foot down on something, it's always going to be the side of supporting business and not workers. I mean, Newsom has done this over and over and over again. And this, again, Democrats are going to keep supporting him because he's a Democrat, and Republicans are going to keep hating him because he's a Democrat. So the way to change things is to change the base and the party and push things. That again gets back to why I got in, the way I was, to try and like push the Democrats themselves, push that Democratic base to change the way they're talking about things. Because right now they've got no incentive. All the money is on the side of like the Newsoms out there, and they're going to dominate all the mailers. They're going to send stuff out, and all the Democrats are like, oh yeah, Newsom stands with us. Newsom supports the workers. Meanwhile, he's going to keep stabbing us in the back the same way Biden did. I mean, Biden can. I want to stand on the picket line for a few minutes with UAW, but he completely sold out the rail unions, and he would do exactly the same thing to UAW or anybody else. It's all just it's performative. It's for show.
Do you think Biden knew where he was when he was standing at that picket line?
What was that?
Do you think Biden knew where he was when he was standing at that picket line?
Yeah, I mean, that's politics. That's the kind of stuff consultants were doing. Like, he needs to show up there. He needs to shore up his support, in like, Midwest working class, areas here, like get people to remember the Democrats stood with them, even though all of his policies say that he doesn't. But at the end of the day, that's part of the base for the party, and you kind of need that. So it's a lot of politics is just show. It's one of the reasons I despise politicians. It's an unfortunate reality. We have to deal with it. It has to exist, but the way the system is structured, it's going to attract people willing to play the game. And it just so happens that the way the parties have aligned themselves in the last 50 years means that neither party can actually support workers. They can both talk about it. Trump can talk about supporting the working class till he's blue in the face. He's selling them out left and right. But the Democratic Party is no better in that issue. But its base is. And this is where I do have a disagreement with the whole, like, well, both parties suck. Okay, yeah, if you're looking only at leadership, that's true. The differences between a Biden and a Trump are actually pretty slim. But the voting base for Democrats is considerably more progressive. And if we were better organized and we were better mobilized on the ground there to put better people in or put pressure on those electeds, we wouldn't be selling out workers, because they do depend upon those votes. What Democrats actually want will matter to Democratic politicians. When Democrats themselves acquiesce, when they accept, oh, this is the best we can hope for, we should just accept what we got. No, get it, burn shit down, whatever. Like, fight back. Like, you do some. I don't mean like literally necessarily, but I mean, like, get active. Push, because if you don't, they're going to keep steamrolling us and it'll never change. No, my view of Newsom is like overwhelmingly negative. So sorry, I'm gonna have nothing nice to say there.
Yeah, I mean, there was a few things Biden did well. Like, there was I don't know if you heard of the NLRB decision, where they said basically there was enough worker like labor infractions that would cause a re-election. They would just have to accept the union, which could really help the Amazon case, right? Because they had to redo the election.
I think something you said that because I will fully cop to this fact that I've said both parties are super similar, but I think something that you said that changed my mind is I will stand by the fact that the leadership, 100%, they support the same parties, they go to the same clubs, they, you get the idea. But you're right, the voting demographics are very different in the sense that, I would even go one step further and say it's not even that Republicans and Democratic voters are different from each other. They're different from their leadership.
Frequently, yeah. And oftentimes, the bigger difference between the two of them are like social issues too. So there are ways to deal with those. At the end of the day, to defeat shit like racism and all the rest of this crap that the rest of the irrational prejudices, it's going to involve a lot of like direct engagement, talking, not lecturing at people, but really talking, because no matter how conservative somebody is, at the end of the day, they will be able to recognize your humanity if they have to face it. Look at so many Republicans like super anti-LGBT, and then their kid comes out, and then suddenly like, oh yeah, no, I'm totally going to defend it, because they had a chance to confront the issue. They had to talk about it. So yeah, oftentimes the people themselves, they really can be worked with, and a lot of the actual Democratic voting base is fairly centrist or center left, while their politicians are all hard right-wing authoritarians. But they tend to think, oh, well, I have these views, so of course the Pelosi's of the world or the Bidens of the world are going to share them. They don't. That it's not where they fall. They'll just say some of the right things. But the people do still have power in these parties. Ordinary people organizing at the local levels, taking over their local parties, taking over their clubs, taking over county parties, state parties. That's honest. That's how the Republican Party got to where it is. It went from being a party of big business to being this nationalist populist party that whipped people up the way because people took over their local parties and then slowly built up. Progressives could do exactly the same thing. And I would want to see that. If ordinary people organized, took control of the county parties, changed the delegations that went to the state conventions, therefore change the organizations themselves. DNC is made up of elected officials and heads of different parts of the party within the state, you know, like you could take control of those. All those institutions are up for grabs. The Republicans already showed it could be done. It took a few decades, but it worked. Democrats could have done, and there is signs that people are doing that. It's, again, one of the reasons I got involved for a while. People can do this, and I do still want to be optimistic that it could change.
I think that's a great answer to that. I think
I mean, do you think this slow progress, if we do like the incremental change, slowly build up like coalitions in states and districts, do you think it'll come fast enough to stop big problems like climate change, you know, and like the possible mass migration of people due to climate change?
yeah, I mean, like the climate change, some of the, what was it, the predictions they've set are pretty bad, right? The floodings and yeah, the mass migrations. It seems like on a level, I can understand why you'd be anti-accelerationist, but do you think some of that action might be needed to stop what's coming?
See, I'll give you a slightly different angle from the accelerationist one on that, because yeah, a lot of the change it would be slow, but if you're building the groundswell and you're pushing in the right direction and crises begin happening, you're in a position to push harder and faster. So if we had enough of the ground game in different counties all across the state of California with people organizing and controlling those local Democratic parties, then major crises start happening, you could seize control of the California Democratic Party, right? I mean, it can advantage you. This is what the right has been doing and has been doing, again, building this stuff up for decades, which means if those crises come, it's just going to tip us out of democracy. They've always wanted minority rule, and that's where they are positioned to tip us permanently into if they get that. They're waiting for those crises to happen. Democrats can do the same thing. The other side of it is, I guess I don't mind some chaos, you know, but I want to see more like in the sense of people power, street politics, you know, mass organizations. You know, the oh, what is it? Extinction something. What's the extinction? Oh, crap, I'm forgetting the name. Ugh, getting going. I keep forgetting names of groups. But there are groups that you could organize behind, and end up, if you can build up popular support, mass movements can push the politics as well. But our biggest problem is that they're often separated. We don't, because of the way money works and because of the way the party structure works, you could think about it, the massive demonstrations we had against the Iraq War. And the government didn't care at all. It made no difference. Or think about like Occupy Wall Street. Tons of people everywhere. What happens? The top 1% gets richer and richer. The government changed? Not at all. Because that people power, that mass movement, the street politics has to push also the political structure. And that's where getting in and seizing control of the county parties and whatnot matters. You're then able to unite the two fronts. You're able then to interact between the street politics of people agitating for real change, and then people on the ground at the lower levels within a particular party, that as these crises come, they have a chance to rise to prominence. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Like you would utilize the movement to push for local like districts to, you know, follow them, and then they can push the party further left. I can see.
And I think a point, just to connect it all together, you said it yourself. I think, you know, think that the old ways of thinking is also a good way to go about it too. Because one thing that you did that again surprises the hell out of me is you running in a conservative area and doing well. That might honestly be the way. I mean, like I've always heard about socialists and union having a lot of support from rural places, mining towns, and those kinds of communities way back in the day. So I mean, the heritage is there. So
Yeah, and again, all these things take a little time, but not necessarily as much as you might think. Given the kind of support around the ideas, the principles that were being pushed in our campaign for a couple of years, right? And the base of support that it had built up. If the party hadn't aggressively tried to get rid of me, we probably could have flipped the seat, because all you needed was to keep building on that. And there's always less turnout in a non-presidential year. So all you had to do was excite all those independents, and the candidate following me didn't. He got the Democratic base out. He had more Democrats because of redistricting, and he only appealed to them. So they came out and voted for him. So of course the Republican still wins because he has a slight advantage number-wise. You need the independents. The model could have worked. My hairy ass could have been in Congress, I mean, and people could do this all over the country. It is entirely possible. So building up from small movements, local stuff like that, it can happen a lot more rapidly than you think. And the crises could actually play to your advantage if you're organizing right. If you're not, they're going to screw us. So we're balanced on a knife edge. And if we can organize better on the ground, we can avoid a negative outcome. But I'm honestly terrified of the direction we're going.
all right, well, I think
Oh wait, one more thing.
one more thing,
A side thing.
side thing.
So why?
Who's the cat?
Oh, okay. There's the cat. Yeah. I was gonna go on the why the puppet political ads?
Oh,
Because I really like them. I like them a lot, and I just went through the whole list.
I would have kicked myself till next week if I didn't ask that. Damn.
Thinking like I'm forgetting the question.
Yeah.
I mean, are you asking why we did it?
I just like.
How did you come up with that?
like going in that direction for political advertising. I thought that was really good. Like
Yeah. Yeah. So a friend of mine works in like film production and whatnot, also enjoys puppeteering, and he just said, like, why don't we combine them instead of like just a short clip with just ordinary people or whatever? Why don't we like do it using the little puppets there? And you just boil down a complex idea into like a 20-second video. And honestly, it's brilliant because it kind of fits the like TikTok, Instagram sort of generations that wants to see the short content. But if you can hit somebody with a really important message in a clever, amusing way. Okay, so it's as awkward as I can be at things like this. It's one of the reasons that I tell terrible jokes in my classes and I use bad memes and all kinds of stuff, because I talk about a lot of really depressing shit. And I think that it's easier to face hard truths with a little humor. So that's at the end of the day, that's where the puppets come in. Like it's a fun, amusing way to tackle really big existential problems and actually put them in front of people in a way that they can really get.
Personal favorite was the authoritarianism versus neo-fascism, the flipping the coin, and they go to like the boot, and I just thought it was really great. And yeah, like it just seemed to be perfect for like YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, TikTok, and like that could really like they support it. Yeah, they just follow a link and then they go.
My favorite one was the one where you come up behind where you have the picture of you and the cowboy get up, and you come behind with the clean, like politician.
Don't
out.
Judge a book by its cover.
Yeah,
if I remember right.
That was a good one. So
yeah, so I have to take the opportunity here at least to plug the creator behind this. So Safi Nizal, and by a fun coincidence, given the topics we had today, he's a Palestinian American. But really, really clever guy, very funny. And he actually works at LA Times now. They've got a unit of like younger people that produce like short, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, that kind of stuff, like little video things. And he uses his puppets with some of those too, which is nice. So he actually got that job because of how good some of these ads were. Like, so please go and support him. Go find him on Instagram. Like, really just a great guy. And yeah, but I loved the idea and loved like collaborating with him on them, because I really do think that a bit of humor makes the painful stuff go down more easily. It's easier to stomach, those uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, I remember being in class, like one of my first political science classes, and I asked the person next to me, like, "Oh, it's like, do you want to major in this? It's pretty interesting." And she was just like, "It's too depressing. Like, it's too sad." And I'm like, that's fair. And like the professor at the time, he was just so enthusiastic. It's sort of like, breaks down the barrier of it being sad because, like, if you're optimistic and you're keeping your head up, it doesn't put you down as much. But yeah, like
Yeah. I'll say this: an enthusiastic professor slash teacher is worth their weight in gold. So, for sure.
Yeah, no, and yeah, exactly. It can help. I mean, the more passionate you are, the more you try to make things relatable. It really can help. I'm honestly not the best at that sort of thing because I'm not really great with people, but I try. And honestly, one of the fun things about the way these things keep track of like health stuff, I get to see just how much my heart rate spikes when I'm lecturing because I'm a massive introvert. I'm an autistic hyperactive introvert. I don't deal with this is my world. But in the classroom I try to bring some of the stuff alive as much as I can, to use a little humor to like really get people to think. And just the effort alone is worthwhile. And honestly, I'm in favor of any kind of experimentation people want to do. So he said puppets, like, oh, sure, why not? Let's do it. Let's find a way to make things relatable, make them fun, but give you a way to still talk about serious shit.
Man, making you broadcast from your cave. I feel that. Broadcasting from my cave. But I think we're about all out of questions.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your time. If you don't mind staying in the call real quick, we're gonna end the stream, but we want to talk to you about something after for a minute, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
So
this is always fun.
Hell yeah! Thank you so much. All right, we're gonna end the stream. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye. Okay, so the stream is officially ended. So we kind of got right into it right away, but I didn't do the introduction. So this is
yeah.
Saul.
Oh yes, sir. Hello, I'm Isaul Carrillo. Right now at UCLA, which political science methods and models. But yeah.
Yeah, and he was my history teacher, and we also watched Vosh too. When I made that connection, my head exploded. So
yeah, at the time I wasn't as into Vosh, but I saw the interview and I was like, wow, like it's like a pseudo Bernie Sanders moment, It's like like people are out there trying that aren't like Gavin Newsom, that aren't just like a political neoliberal just shill,
And I think it's also good. Yeah, sorry, go on. Sorry to cut you off.
No, I was going to say I think honestly that authenticity resonates with people.
Yeah.
Just being like setting aside all the scripted, sculpted political shit. It's riskier. It's dangerous. Obviously, I stuck my foot in it by being too stressed and phrasing something badly. But I think the fact that I called her out actually still does resonate with a lot of people. I didn't lose any popular support. I lost the party. I got tons and tons and tons of supporting messages from Democrats, anybody else like I didn't lose friends over this. What I lost was the Riverside County Democratic Party and the California Democratic Party. They found an opportunity to get rid of an inconvenient kind of politician so they could go back to what they wanted, and that's fine. So you're always going to have that kind of risk. But I think that's great. I would rather more people step up, and if they fuck up, but there's still more people. The reason we have such a massive leadership crisis is that there's so few people that are willing to push through and try to do this and create those nice voices. I want more Nina Turners out there. I love that she does this shit, but it's not enough. You need 10,000 of her. If we get more people stepping up and running for dog catcher, I mean, people don't run for local offices. The Republicans snap them up because they've got tons of money. So every single county in this country is in trouble. Democrats used to control a large majority of state houses, and they now control a minority of them because they've slowly allowed Republicans to seize control of counties and then work their way up to the state parties. And that makes them far more powerful in Washington than they should be.
I mean, I think the most interesting part about all this is I think you're proof to a lot of people who think about apathy, how they have no place. I think you're honestly living proof that that's not true. I mean, you're an anarchist who got 43% of the vote in a conservative state. Like, no, like you can't just sneeze at that. You know what I mean? That
Mm-hmm.
is so I think that is probably the
Right.
most encouraging part of this.
Yeah, exactly. And I did it as a long-haired anarchist who wasn't changing any of his positions. I told people that my origins were like in the labor left and in the anarchist, socialist movement at the very like in my very first interview. And I never backed away from that shit. It doesn't matter as long as people are still willing to talk to you. I literally got Republicans to change their voter registration from conversations with me. It does happen, but people usually aren't willing to take the risk of having those conversations and really trying to push ordinary people along. So thanks. I mean, I appreciate the compliment in it. For me, I'm simply just shocked that an outspoken anarchist, autistic academic did anything in politics at all. The fact that I got unanimously supported by the party for my run and actually did fairly well in it, I'm always going to be happy with that. The canceling shit doesn't stress me out.
When you say you're
I know
shocked,
what I was trying to say.
when you said you were shocked, I thought, man, it's rough out there, huh? Like,
Well, it's
God.
I didn't expect it would do as well as it did, and I'm honestly it tells me that people really could do what I was doing and do it more easily than I did in some ways. Because some people bring fewer disadvantages to it. If you're organized right, if you have the right kind of mentality, if you can get past the big money interests and the consultant class and just do what needs to be done with ordinary people, I think the whole country could be changed. I do not believe this country needs to be this deeply right-wing state that it is. I think we can achieve the kind of balance we had before, but it's going to take work.
Is there anything you would have done differently, going in hindsight, 2020 vision?
In terms of the race itself, I wish that it had been easier for me to do a lot of the phone calls to raise more money, because when I was doing it, I did fairly well, but it takes a lot out of me. It's very, very difficult to cold call people and ask for money. I have a hard time asking my mother for anything. It just, the way I'm wired doesn't really suit fundraising. So I don't know. I wish I'd found a way to get better at that and could manage the stress better, and it would have put us in a slightly better position for more ads early on. But beyond that, I don't think it would have changed anything about that race. I mean, no, I don't think that I would have done it differently, because I'm still amazed that we did as well as we did. And I think that the way that it turned out in 2020, every indication was that it could have flipped on the next race or two, because the support was building in the area to completely transform that politics in it. I just stepped in it because of who I am, but it could be done.
All right, I think I'm gonna be real with you for a moment because professionalism, but it's fucking hot in this goddamn room. I am melting. So we're gonna call it here, but we would like it if you come on the show in the distant future. You're our second interview, and what's funny is that we've interviewed actually some characters. Our first interview was a rapper, so yeah. we've been dabbling in interviews, and we're gonna be doing more in the near future. So again, I really appreciate you coming on, and
I would. Again, I'll just plug him because you mentioned the puppets a few times. Contact Safi, or I could put you in touch with him. I'm sure he'd enjoy coming on there and talking about what he was trying to do, because he does want to improve things too. We have conversations all the time. He would love to have that feeling again, like we had in the campaign, that you're actually doing something, and it might, like, a sense of hope, because he's like exactly the kind of audience you're talking about. That sense of, like, you can get frustrated and apathetic. Like, it's not changing, nothing's working, and you get depressed about it, and people drift away. But when you have a goal, a purpose, some kind of idea. He's been trying to come up with some kind of way to do something similar again, to actually have an impact. So I think just that whole question of like, how do you deal with the apathy? How do you find hope? How do you find outlets that can really reach people? It might be an interesting conversation for you.
Yeah, can you spell his name for us? Or can you send me his Instagram possibly?
Let's see. Let me I could send the links to you later. I'll put
send it over Instagram. You have me on Instagram.
Oh yeah, so. Sure. I'll just send you the links and the name there. Yeah, but so that's, but yeah, if you guys want to chat about something else in future, just let me know. I mean,
I'll make one last point. You know, the fact that you brought up we can actually interview someone, a Palestinian, is honestly really convenient because, like I said, we talked to a neighbor who's Palestinian, and he kind of said the same thing. Like, he feels kind of underrepresented by the media because, like, it's people like, you know, no offense, but people like us, people like the news, Israel, like, they're dominating the sound. Like, Palestinians aren't
putting them on the defensive every single time.
But Palestinians aren't even on the waves to play defense. You know what I mean? They're barely shown, and when they're shown, it's, you know.
I'm honestly really impressed in the way that things have been shifting. So if you look at the support issue, the questions around all this stuff for millennials and Gen Z, it's much more evenly split. It's the older generations that are just hardcore Israel can do nothing, no wrong, and fuck the Palestinians. When I grew up, the only time a Palestinian was mentioned in the media was when you're talking about like a hijacking or on an airliner or something, like with some kind of terrorist act. Palestinians were Palestinian equals terrorist. There was no nuance. There was no conversation. There was no humanization. So I appreciate that there's at least a shift generationally there, but they are cut out of major media still. Their perspectives are just, if they show up at all, they're caricatured.
I think that'll be it. And yeah, also I'll text you for the to get the guys' info. But yeah, thank you again, man.
Thank you for coming on.
You have a good night.
No worries. Yep. Have a great night.
Yep. Goodbye.
See you.
I'm gonna end the recording and then end the call.